So factories, we can see here in the background a photo of London back in the industrial era or the Industrial Revolution. And you can see all the different factories going from the forefront all the way into the background. Now, when we're talking about these factories, it's important to think about the people who worked in them also. Okay, so Cale brought up a very good question there yesterday where he talked about why was there children working in these factories, and especially working down in the coal mines. Now, we're going to go a bit into that in today's chapter. So, factories use unskilled workers to mass produce products. Now, that was because of they could pay them less, and they also didn't have to train them as much. Now, prior to factories being set up, England used to depend on a cottage industry to provide materials such as fabric or cotton or sheets or any sort of material that you would wear. It depended on a cottage industry. Now, what I mean by that is that different cottages and different homes would have one seamstress or one person who was very good at working on a flywheel or a knitting wheel, I think it's called, and they would create their own fabric at home and sell it then to a person who was a wholesaler, and they would put all the fabrics together to make different clothing. So it used to produce income for a lot of women that worked at home so that they wouldn't have to go out to work in an industry. Now, as soon as the Industrial Revolution came along, these jobs were gone and all the workforce had to go to factories instead to be mass produced. Now, the advantage to these factories was they could produce goods that were cheaper, faster, and in larger quantities. So they could produce products way faster, that they could create, say, a jumper in half the time. It was also cheaper to produce it than the cottage industries, and they could produce larger quantities due to the size of the machines that they were using and due to the amount of people working in this industry. So it was a mass production on a large scale. Now, this also meant that factories could now be set up inside in towns, thanks to steam engines, because they didn't depend on rivers in the countryside and rivers that were being unused at the time. Now, the man accredited to these industries being set up was a man called Richard Arkwright. Now, he was known to have set up a factory in 1769, so early on in the Industrial Revolution, in Cromford near Derby. Now, this is an image of the factory, and as we can see, it has chimneys coming out of it, which were an iconic, important aspect of these factories. But we can also see that there is multiple different layers of the factory. Okay, so there's different floors. Now, I'll be telling you why that's so important to note later. So inside in these factories, it was very, very dangerous, okay, and it was also very bad conditions. So when we're talking about factory life or what the life was like in the factory, factories ran for profits. So they had little to no concern over people's health and safety, and they never really considered about people's well-being or welfare. Okay, many people were maimed, meaning that they were injured or scarred or bruised from the machinery. They lost limbs or even their lives. Okay, and we'll be looking at how different children were used for different machinery in later slides, and you'll be seeing the injuries they used to be. Now, going back to the idea of the unskilled worker, a very important thing that was developed was the division of labor. So before this era, there would have been blacksmiths who were highly skilled people at their craft. There would have been bakers who were brought up to be bakers throughout their families, and they would have learned how to become bakers because their parents would have been bakers, and it was a very skilled artwork. Now, the division in labor was the complete opposite version of that. So each worker was given a specific task and in making of a product, and didn't need to know or have knowledge of the whole process. Okay, now this meant owners could use unskilled workers. So for instance here we can see them setting up an engine. Now obviously this would have been after the Industrial Revolution, but it was just an image that I found that sums it up quite well. So this fellow over here is putting in the camshafts onto the engine, but the guy in the next stage doesn't know what camshafts are because he was never trained to do that. He was only trained how to put in spark plugs. And then the guy afterwards is putting on a flywheel onto the front of an engine, and the guy after that is tightening. So what I mean by all this is if you ask the guy who's doing the flywheels how to put in spark plugs, he wouldn't know because he was never trained. But this meant that it was very easy just to train someone to do one job instead of all of the jobs along the assembly line. And it meant that you wouldn't have to get a skilled worker. You could just train them to do one job for the day and pay them pittance instead of paying a skilled worker to assemble a whole engine or to create a whole product. Now, inside these factories, it was very noisy because, as you can see, there was rows upon rows of machines, followed by rows upon rows of people working on these machines. And the spinning jenny and the flying shuttle were actually a very noisy machine too, as it would hit each time it went back and forward. So these were noisy machines, they were overcrowded, so there was a lot of injuries from people being pushed around and shoved. And there were harsh rules inside that were instructed by the officials or the managers inside in the place, and there were strict punishments enforced to those who did not obey the rules. Now, going back to Kale's question, which is a very important one, and I just thought I'd put in this slide just to answer a bit more about Kale's question. So, women and children were primarily the people working inside in these factories. So we can see here an image of two children that look around 5 or 6 working on this cotton mill that would have been creating linen or jumpers for different fabric for clothing. Now you can see here that the two children have no shoes. They're clearly in bad condition, and yet they're looking after this machinery. While nowadays they would have had steel toe caps, and they certainly wouldn't be kids, okay, nearly climbing into these machines. We also see a woman down here trying to fix a machine, trying to get the thread all the way through, and we can see here that overlooking is the manager, who would have been a male at the time, and we'll be going into that a bit more later. So the reason why they hired primarily women and children as workers on these machines was women were paid half of what a man was paid, and children were paid even less. So it meant that they were being discriminated against because of their gender and because of their age, just for more payment into the Industrial Revolution. Now, for the same reason why they used children in the coal mines, it was down to the fact that children were smaller and they could crawl under machines if a thread broke. So if one of these threads broke in one of the spindle machines, the kids would be expected to crawl in through the machines and they would be able to sort it out, while a grown man wouldn't be able to. Now, this is just a random photo that I found online, but you can clearly see in the background here where a child has his jaw sewn, or it's like bandaged up from his injuries. You can clearly see where this child has no shoes and his shirt is tattered from different things tearing off the back of his shirt. So this was a very dangerous job, and it basically led a lot of kids to their death. Now, a man's role in these factories, and it's important to actually understand the layout of these factories and understand who was in control and the domineering tactics that they used. So, a man's role in these factories was usually as an overseer or supervisor or a manager. Okay, now, these people were used to bully and intimidate women and children within the workforce. So we clearly see here where there's a row of spindle machines and they're all sewing different threads, and you have different children working on this industrial line, and you have this man overseeing a child intimidating them to get them to work faster and work more productively. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation for today. So by now you should know this, or you should know how the steam engine advanced and how it changed the industry. You should also know how the industry developed from the cottage industry to a more industrial industry. Okay. Then thirdly, you should also know what the division of labor is, which is very important to understand, and you should also know what conditions were like in a factory. Okay, so be sure to take your notes down on the different points. It's very important to understand what the event or how the steam engine helped the Industrial Revolution advance from the water mills and the water wheels. It's also very important to understand how the industrial or how the industry changed from the cottage industry to the industrial industry. Okay, the division of labor shows how people used to be trained in these factories, and also the conditions within the factories are very important to understand who the people were working in these factories. Okay, I hope this video helped, guys. Let me know if you have any other questions on it or any further questions. Best of luck.